For our game, we did Defender, a 1981 side-scrolling alien shooter. This first screen is our language selection screen, and you can see that the slide pot controls which language we're going to select. For now, we're going to do English, and if we die later on, we will switch it to Spanish. So, our first button over here is the fire button, which can kill enemies, as you can see. The second button is a hyperspace button that changes our positioning, and the third button is a directional button, which changes which direction we're facing. When you change directions, the ship simply slides smoothly between two different X positions, whereas when you're in hyperspace, the ship's position doesn't change, but the position of the enemies and terrain around it changes. The map at the top helps the player see this by showing a white box with their current view, as well as what's ahead and behind them. The terrain at the bottom of the screen was randomly generated, and then we had to shrink it down to 1/8 the size to fit into the map. And so we used various Excel functions to create that terrain generation. So the terrain remains the same between games. Enemies maintain their position relative to the terrain even as the player enters hyperspace, and are represented by green pixels on the map, so which allows you to see what enemies are ahead of you and behind you and in your current frame. So 2 are coming up, 1 is coming up. As you can see, there he is. Perfect. There are only 2 enemy types at the moment. Both have sprites from the original game. Here we can see we're going to switch to Spanish. There we go. Only 2 enemy types. The only difference between them right now is the flat enemies move faster, and they all drift around hoping to run into the player, and when they run into the player loses a life, which you can see here. Perfect. The enemy's spawn rate also increases with the player's score, making the game more and more difficult, and creating a kind of endless mode where you need to stay alive as long as possible to accumulate score. In this current version, we set the score to 80,000 when you start, so that the enemy spawn rate is very high, so we can show off the game. In the original game, the enemies also shoot the player, but due to time constraints and issues with hyperspace, they aren't in this final version. We also have 3 sounds, which you should be able to hear, which are driven by cystic interrupts. Here we're going to go back to English. There's the English. So the first sound is the bullet shooting. You can see there. The second sound is when we kill an enemy. If we can find one here. There. And the third sound is when an enemy hits us and we lose a life. There we go. The cystic interrupt goes at 11 kilohertz. We also have a clock interrupt at 1 hertz for enemy spawning. We have a background interrupt at 50 hertz for position changes and slide pot syncs. And as I said before, the other 3 buttons are interrupt driven. And the hyperspace button is actually driven on both edges, so that when you release it, you go out of hyperspace, whereas the others simply toggle what you're doing. Enemies and bullets both use linked list data structure to allow for quick and simple deletion. We originally tried to use the standard library linked list, but it was too big for our linker, and so we had to write our own linked list class. And lastly, bullets also have a tracer effect, as in the original game. So you can see that every time a bullet is spawned in, it is given a randomized color and randomly deletes the tracer field behind it. So you get this effect of seeing where the bullets come from and having a brighter trail of light behind it than from its original position. And that's our game. Thank you very much.